Hi, my name is James Carter. I'm 37 years old, and for most of my life, I've considered myself a happy man. I had a strong family, a great job, and a circle of close friends who could be counted on at any time. My mornings began with my wife's smile, and my evenings ended with her quiet laughter as we discussed the previous day. But life, as it turned out, is not only bright moments. Sometimes fate, as a skillful scriptwriter, prepares for us such turns that the whole reality collapses overnight. The story I want to tell you began quite ordinary. It was one of those days when everything seems ordinary, but you don't suspect that a storm is waiting for you around the corner. I don't know if I would have been able to change anything if I had known how it would end. But one thing I realized for sure, the truth cannot be hidden, no matter how painful it may be. I woke up to my phone ringing somewhere away from the bed. It was early morning. The sunlight was shining through the thick curtains, and my wife Amanda was breathing quietly beside me. I got up, trying not to disturb her sleep, and went to look for my phone. The name of Mark, one of my best friends, popped up on the screen. "Hey, James, how about a little trip?" he asked cheerfully, not even greeting me. I grinned. Knowing Mark, calls like that were his usual manner. He'd always been the one to burst into life with spontaneous parties, camping trips, or outings. "Trips now? Are you serious?" I glanced at Amanda, who was still sleeping peacefully, and lowered my voice. "Totally. It had been a long time since we'd had a real man's vacation. Hell, James, we promised each other we'd get out of this rut at least once a year." Mark was right. Over the last couple of years, we've really gotten caught up in family life, work, and life. I said I'd think about it and hung up. When I got back to the bedroom, I looked at Amanda for a long time, wondering how she would react to my sudden proposal. "Did you want something?" Her voice brought me out of my reverie. "Mark suggested a trip," I said, trying to sound casual. "I thought it would be for a couple days." She nodded silently and rolled onto her other side. It didn't seem to bother her, though she'd always asked about it before. I decided not to dwell on it, chalking up her silence to morning sleepiness. The idea for the trip quickly took shape. Mark and I were joined by two other friends, Alex and Tom. We decided to go to a national park to spend a few days in the silence of nature, away from work and family worries. Preparing for the trip was full of hustle and bustle. We shopped for groceries, discussed the itinerary, and joked around like teenagers before summer camp. However, behind all this fun, I began to notice something strange. In recent weeks, Amanda had become different. She no longer asked questions about my day, wasn't interested in my plans, and sometimes she could just leave the house without explanation. I tried to convince myself that it was just the little things that happen in any marriage, but a sense of unease had already settled in. The trip started with a light and friendly atmosphere. We joked, reminisced about past trips, talked about work and life. Everything was fine until in the evening around the campfire, Mark started talking about his wife. "Do you guys ever feel like your wives have gotten too busy?" "Busy?" he asked, shaking the beer bottle in his hand. We looked at each other. It was an unexpected question, especially coming from Mark, who always seemed the most confident in his marriage. "What do you mean?" Tom asked. "I don't know. Sometimes it just feels like she's hiding something," he shrugged, as if trying to dismiss the thought. The words were stuck in my head. I didn't want to admit it to myself, but similar doubts were starting to creep into my mind. I tried to change the subject, but the conversation about trust and cheating kept coming up again and again. The next day, we continued our journey through the national park. The morning was sunny, the air was fresh, and everyone's mood was slowly improving after the night's conversations. But Mark's words still hung in the air, leaving a strange sense of tension. We stopped by the lake for a short break. Tom was making sandwiches, Alex was digging into his backpack, and Mark and I were alone. "Do you really think there's something wrong with your wife?" I asked, trying not to look too interested. "I don't know, James." He looked at the water thoughtfully. "It's just that her behavior seems strange to me lately. She's been staying late at work a lot, and she's been on the phone at home." I nodded but didn't say anything. It all sounded too familiar. Amanda was always with her phone in her hands too. I tried to convince myself that it was normal, that she was just texting her friends or browsing social media, but now the thought was starting to gnaw at me from the inside out. "Had you tried talking to her?" I asked cautiously. "Yes, of course, but she denies it, says I'm imagining things. Maybe that's true, or maybe I just don't want to see the truth." We didn't talk. This conversation raised more questions than it answered. In the evening, we decided to stay at one of the camping sites. We made a fire, sat in a circle, poured the whiskey Alex had brought. The atmosphere was warm again, but I still felt uneasy inside. When the others had gone to their tents, Mark sat down next to me again. "Look, James, you feel something too, don't you?" he asked, looking straight into my eyes. I wanted to lie, to say that I was fine, that his words were just fantasies, but I couldn't. Yeah, Amanda had changed too. I thought it was just stress or fatigue, but I wasn't sure anymore. Mark nodded, as if he'd expected that answer. We have to find out the truth, James. Not just about our wives, but about ourselves. Those words struck a chord with me. He was right. I couldn't go on living with this feeling of doubt. But what could we do? On the third day of the trip, everything changed. Mark suggested we check out what was going on at home while we were away. We decided to use social networks and our mutual acquaintances to gather some data. Alex, who had always been a techie, joined in enthusiastically. He knew how to search for hidden profiles, analyze data, and even pick the locks on phones if necessary. I don't want to spy on Amanda, I said when he suggested I look at her phone remotely. Then don't do it, he shrugged. But if you don't find out the truth, it'll gnaw at you for the rest of your life. His words sounded harsh but fair. Mark started by asking one of his coworkers to check if his wife was really working late. The results were surprising. She left at 6 o'clock sharp, but didn't get home until midnight. Tom discovered strange messages on his wife's cell phone. She was clearly communicating with someone he knew nothing about. And then it was my turn. I couldn't believe my eyes when Alex showed me Amanda's correspondence. There were messages she'd been sending to some Jason. They were innocent enough, but the tone and content indicated more than just friendship. It could just be a friend, I said, trying to find some excuse. James, it's not a friend, Alex replied dryly. You realize that. My head was spinning. Everything inside was screaming with pain and rage, but I knew it was a mistake to jump to conclusions now. I decided not to say anything to my friends until I had more evidence. But the night I spent in the tent was the longest night of my life. I lay looking up at the stars, thinking about one thing. How could I go home and look her in the eye knowing that? The last day of our journey was a turning point. Alex, who was the most persistent in his actions, suggested that we all do what he called a final check. We agreed that we would return home earlier than planned to find out what our wives were actually doing while we were gone. This plan seemed crazy, but on the other hand, we no longer had the energy to wait. Each of us wanted to know the truth, even if it would be devastating. It was a long road home ahead, and with every kilometer I felt my heart fill with fear. I didn't know what awaited me, but I was prepared for the worst. We drove back in suppressed silence. Usually these trips were accompanied by jokes, loud music, and conversation, but now there was silence in the car. Each of us seemed to be wrestling with our own thoughts, trying to prepare for what awaited us back home. Mark, who was usually the most talkative, was unrecognizable. He sat in the front seat staring out the window, only occasionally checking his phone. Tom, who was sitting next to me, looked confused. He was clearly not ready to face the truth. What do you think is in store for us? He asked quietly. I don't know, Tom, but it's better to know the truth than to live in ignorance, I said, trying to sound confident even though I was trembling inside. What if we're wrong? What if it's all just a fantasy? He continued. I wanted to answer him, but Alex intervened. If you think so, why did you go for it in the first place? His voice was firm, almost harsh. Don't forget that we all deserve to know who we live with. His words silenced us. He was right, but that didn't make what was coming any easier. We decided that we would each go home separately, so as not to attract attention. I dropped Mark off first, then Tom, and then Alex asked me to stop the car near his house. I was the only one left. As I pulled up to our house, I felt my heart start to pound faster. I took a few deep breaths trying to calm down, but it wasn't helping. The house was quiet with no sign of anyone inside. I parked the car a block away from the house so Amanda wouldn't hear the engine. Slowly, I walked to the door and froze. Everything looked normal. Cleanly washed windows, a manicured lawn. But something wasn't right. I put the key in the lock, but I didn't turn it. There was a struggle inside me. Part of me wanted to leave, to pretend it hadn't happened, and another part of me wanted to go in and find out the truth. Finally, I made up my mind. The door opened and I stepped inside. The house was quiet. The living room was a mess. An open book on the couch, a blanket thrown on the floor. I went into the kitchen. Everything was in its place, except for the 2 wine glasses on the table. One was empty, the other half full. My heart clenched. I cautiously climbed the stairs. The top floor was our bedroom, and the door to it was ajar. I froze in front of it, listening. From behind the door came a muffled laugh. It was her voice. I swung the door open. The picture I saw was one I'll never forget. Amanda was sitting on our bed with a man next to her. They both turned around at the sound of the door opening. James, you're back! Her face turned pale and her voice trembled. I couldn't get a word out. I just stood there staring at them, trying to figure out how this could have happened. "Who are you?" I finally said, turning to the man. "It's not what you think," Amanda interrupted quickly, trying to stand up, but I held up my hand to stop her. I don't want to hear your excuses, Amanda," I said quietly but firmly. She lowered her head and the man started to say something, but I wasn't even listening. My heart was broken. I couldn't believe that everything I'd believed in had turned out to be a lie. I took a step back and walked out of the room. She tried to catch up with me, yelling, asking me to stop, but I couldn't hear anything. I walked out of the house, got in my car, and drove away. All I felt was emptiness. When I arrived at Mark's house, he was already waiting for me on the doorstep. His face was as pained as mine. "Well?" All he asked me was, "It's true," I said. He nodded, and we hugged each other like brothers who had lost their dearest. At that moment, we both realized that the life we had known was over. I sat on the couch in Mark's house, surrounded by a silence that seemed deafening. There was an unfinished mug of coffee on the table in front of me, but I didn't even try to touch it. My mind tossed between the tattered memories of happy days and the cold reality I had to face. "How are you?" Mark asked, coming out of the kitchen with a bottle of whiskey and 2 glasses. "I don't know what to say," I said. "How about you?" He poured us each a generous portion and sat down across from me. "It sucks, James. I feel like an idiot. I lived 10 years with a man I didn't even know. We drank, and I felt the warmth of the alcohol spread through my body, but it didn't help dull the pain. The next few days were the most difficult time of my life. I avoided going home. I didn't answer Amanda's calls, but inside I knew that sooner or later I would have to talk to her. I stayed with Mark and later joined him and Alex as they began to share their stories. It turned out that I wasn't alone in my distress. She said she loved me, but she was just confused, Mark told me, clutching the glass so hard his fingers turned white. "How can you be confused enough to sleep with someone else?" "Mine didn't even try to make excuses," Alex said grimly. "She just looked me in the eye and said, 'You never understood me anyway.'" Tom, who was sitting next to me, just nodded but didn't say anything. He looked lost. "What about you, Tom? Did you learn anything?" I asked cautiously. He looked up, and I could see the pain in his eyes that was familiar to all of us. "Yes," he answered quietly. "She was cheating too, a long time ago. We started to get together every night, as if supporting each other was the only thing that kept us from going crazy. In those moments, we tried to make sense of what had happened, to understand why our lives had fallen apart. I often thought back to the night I found Amanda with another man. Every time I saw her pale face, her attempts at explanations that I didn't even want to hear. Mark had suggested that I talk to my wife like the others to get to the bottom of this, but I wasn't ready. What was there to talk about? She made her choice, I told him, staring out the window. "You deserve answers, James, not to her but to myself," he said. The words stuck in my head. A week later, I pulled myself together and came home. Amanda was waiting for me. She looked exhausted, as if she'd been through it all, but I didn't allow myself to feel sorry for her. "We need to talk," I said, walking into the living room. She nodded and sat down across from me. "Why, Amanda?" I asked, looking into her eyes. I don't know, James," she began, her gaze lowered. "It started with me feeling lonely. You were at work all the time, and we didn't talk much." "And that's your reason?" I interrupted, feeling anger rising in my chest. "Instead of talking to me, you decided to seek comfort from someone else?" "It's no excuse, I know," her voice shook. "But I just wanted to feel alive." I turned away so she wouldn't see the pain contorting my face. "Do you realize what you've done? You destroyed everything we'd built." "James, I still love you." Her voice was desperate. "I made a mistake, but I want to make it right." "Make it right?" I grinned bitterly. "Some things can't be fixed, Amanda." That conversation was the end of the line for me. I realized I couldn't trust her anymore. Even though her words about wanting to make things right sounded sincere, I knew we couldn't be together anymore. I spent the next few weeks preparing for the divorce. Each of us, me, Mark, Alex, and Tom, faced this difficult process, and we supported each other as best we could. But this journey was far from over. After all, divorce is not just a legal procedure. It is a slow and painful process of saying goodbye to the past. After I finally made the decision to divorce, everything seemed unreal. I felt trapped again, only now it was inside me, in my head. Everything I had built over the years had crumbled to dust. Even the simplest things, the comforts of home, the familiar rituals, the evening conversations, all seemed foreign. I looked at Amanda, and I realized that I could no longer see her as the woman I'd once planned my future with. The divorce proceedings dragged on. Amanda and I found lawyers, exchanged a few letters, but something was wrong. Every day when I came home, I had to face her stares, her attempts to win me back. She tried to convince me that things could be fixed, that her feelings weren't gone, that she'd made a mistake, but I knew it didn't matter anymore. Mistakes aren't fixed that way. Mark, seeing me sinking deeper and deeper into the process, offered to help. He came to me once to talk to me about how best to behave in court, how to secure a better deal for myself. But his words sounded like empty noise. I felt nothing but bitterness. "You can't live like this, James," he said when I tried to shut the subject up again. "You have to go all the way. You deserve peace of mind." But it was hard, really hard, because every decision I made was tied to the bitter reality that I no longer knew who this person who had once been my wife was. Even if I stayed, how could I live with what she had done? Could I trust her again? Alex, for his part, suggested seeing a counselor. He had been through a similar journey himself, and he said that after everything that had happened, I needed to learn to live in harmony with myself again. I didn't want to listen to him at first, but finally agreed. It turned out to be exactly what I needed. The psychologist helped me realize that despite all the pain that was tearing me apart, I had to move forward. No matter what happened, my life was not to be affected by what happened to Amanda. I had to take back control of myself and my future. But despite the help and support of my friends, deep down I felt like I had lost a part of myself. It's not just a divorce. It wasn't just the end of a relationship. It was a moment when I lost a part of my identity, a part of who I was. I tried to get that part back, looking for myself in new activities and meeting people and new hobbies, but it wasn't coming back. I couldn't forget what all that destruction looked like, how life seemed to be turned upside down. My days became more and more monotonous. I went to work, I went back to my normal activities, but my life had no meaning. Home became a foreign place, and even as I began to spend more time with friends, I was haunted by a feeling of emptiness. Something important was missing. I missed normal life, the time when Amanda and I were making plans for the future. Tom called me one of those nights and asked me to meet him. He and I had a heart-to-heart talk about life after the divorce. "I needed you to see the truth," he said when I told him about my doubts. "You can't go back in time. You're not the same person you were before, and she's not the same person she was." I knew he was right, but the pain in my heart was still there. It was the pain of betrayal, the pain of having the trust I'd spent so long building broken. The divorce process was heating up. There were no victories or easy steps along the way. I continued to fight for my share of the property, for everything we had gained over the years of marriage. But it was much harder to fight with myself. Every day I could feel myself slowly losing strength. Mark and Alex supported me, even though we were each in our own hell. We started talking about how our lives would change after the divorce, what the future held for us. But amidst all the talking, I realized that I hadn't fully realized that everything I knew was shattered. And then Amanda showed up again. She called me one night. "James, I'm begging you, let's talk. I can't go on like this without knowing how you feel. Will you ever forgive me?" I didn't know what to say. I didn't have the words. I was so exhausted, I didn't know what I needed anymore. Forgiveness isn't just words. It was more than that, and I wasn't ready to find the strength to forgive her right now. But this encounter with Amanda got me thinking, what kind of world am I living in now? What will I be when this is over? I began to realize that I can't bring back the past, but I can build my future. And maybe I need to leave her behind to start living again. A few weeks passed and the divorce process entered its final stages. I continued to see Amanda from time to time, and each time these encounters left me devastated. She kept trying to talk about how things could be fixed, that she had realized her mistakes. But I couldn't listen to her excuses anymore. It wasn't a question of forgiveness, it was a question of who I was now and who I would be in the future. One night, sitting at the bar with Mark and Alex, I thought again about what was, what is, and what will be. We sat at the bar, drinking a cup of beer each, trying to make some sense of this mess that had happened to us. My friends were supportive, as always, but I could feel the weight on my shoulders not going away. "Are you ever really going to get back to normal, James?" Alex asked, looking at me with a slight worry in his eyes. "I don't know," I answered, sighing heavily. "But maybe I'll learn to live without her, and that's probably the best option. But it won't be easy." Mark nodded, agreeing with what I was saying. We'd all been through our own personal dramas in one way or another, but now it was all about how to get on with our lives. All my life I had prided myself on being able to handle adversity. I had always considered myself a strong person, capable of surviving any challenge. But now I had to face something I never expected, betrayal from someone I shared my life with. And not just a betrayal, but the destruction of the very idea of what was important to me. A home, a family, a trust. It was all gone. The divorce process became increasingly formal and unpleasant. Amanda and I never met again, but we continued to correspond through lawyers. Every letter she wrote was another reminder that we no longer existed as a couple. It was over. But there were still a lot of questions inside of me. I knew I would relive it for a long time. No matter how hard I tried to suppress those feelings, they still came out. One of those days, as usual, I picked up a letter from my lawyer, which was about the divorce and the final division of property. Once home, I just sat and stared at the blank walls. Everything seemed unimportant. I knew that for me, I needed to move on. But how? How do I get myself back after what happened? I started to remember the things that used to bring me joy. Work, seeing friends, old hobbies that I had once given up, simply because I thought it was more important to do with my family. It seemed empty now, but I still tried to restore at least a part of my old life. Suddenly an idea popped into my head. I decided to go to the place where Amanda and I had spent our honeymoon. It was a decision more intuitive than logical, but I knew I needed to do something drastic to get rid of those memories. Accept that the past was gone, that I wasn't that person anymore, and that you couldn't hold on to something that no longer existed. While I was packing, a call from Amanda caught me off guard again. She wanted to meet, to talk again. It was her last attempt to reconnect or something. But I knew it was a waste of time. "We can't go back to the way things were, Amanda," I said, feeling the heaviness on my soul get a little lighter. "It's over, and I'm ready to let go. We both have to move forward." She was silent for a moment, and then quietly and discreetly she said, "I hope you find your happiness, James. For real." I hung up, not knowing how she really felt. Maybe she was sorry for what she'd done, or maybe it was just her trying to justify her actions. But in that moment, I realized that I didn't need to seek her forgiveness. I needed to find my own forgiveness. I went to a place that had once been important to both of us. A bustling city on the coast, where we'd biked along the waterfront, where we'd strolled through the markets and laughed as we watched the sunsets. I was there again, and it wasn't to reclaim the past. I went there to realize that I couldn't get that time back again. I needed to forgive myself and let go. I saw people who didn't know me enjoying the same moments I once had, and I realized it was okay. They are creating their memories, and I can create new ones too. I was coming home with a different thought, no longer with the thought of getting her back, but of learning to live again. I didn't know what the future held, but I knew one thing. Everything that had happened could no longer define me, and that was my true liberation. A few months passed and life began to take on a new shape. I was no longer the same person I was before the divorce. All those days spent in empty rooms and thinking about what I had lost were now a part of the past. I had opened up new horizons for myself, slowly releasing my soul from the weight of my experiences. As I returned to my work, I noticed how the threat that had pressed me before had disappeared. I was no longer bound by obligations that prevented me from developing. Tasks at work became easier to take on, and moments when I was surrounded by friends brought me joy. I began to rebuild relationships with those I cared about, without hidden expectations, without attachment to previous myths of what a relationship should be. I was no longer afraid of loneliness, and perhaps that was the main lesson I took away from the whole tragedy. But it didn't turn out to be that simple. I still felt lonely, and although I had friends, I often fell asleep wondering if I would ever be able to trust anyone again. This question haunted me. Do I even see the possibility of a new beginning? And if so, when would it be? I didn't know. Mark and Alex were there for me, as always, but I realized that our situation had diverged. They were still going through their internal battles with the same painful questions as I was, but we were each on our own quest. We met, discussed what we would do next, and laughed about the moments when it seemed like we couldn't get out of it. But time put everything in its place, and we felt more and more each day that we could move on. One evening, sitting with Mark in his apartment, I felt the time was right. He was still the same. A friend you can rely on. Someone you can talk to about your deepest feelings. At this time, as my thoughts of the past were becoming more and more distant, he said one phrase that made me think. "You're probably ready, James, to go back to the world we left behind," he said, looking at me. "But you're not the same person you used to be. You're stronger now. You're not afraid of everything you were ready to lose anymore." Those words penetrated me like a revelation. I realized that I was ready for a new phase in my life. I let go of what was holding me back. I became stronger. And now, instead of looking back at the past, I could boldly look forward to the future. The moment I met Laura was a turning point for me. She was nothing like Amanda, but there was something about her that reminded me of the person I had once been. She was sincere, open, without falseness. We met at one of my coworker meetings, and from the first few minutes of conversation, I felt like I could be myself with her. We began to communicate, and although I was cautious in the beginning, I gradually found in Laura the very sincerity that I lacked. She didn't rush things, respected my boundaries, and gave me space to open up. Every day I spent with Laura seemed like a step toward restoring what seemed impossible after the divorce. I learned to trust again, to feel part of the world I knew again, but in a new capacity. As time passed, I became more and more convinced that there was no perfect way to recover from such a loss. But every step I took was a step forward. I began to realize that I shouldn't be afraid to open my heart, even if it was broken. Mark and Alex continued to search for answers, and I knew I needed to move on without looking back at the past. We no longer talked about going back to that old world. Instead, we began to build new meanings in life, trying our hand at something that gave us real fulfillment. We realized that the most important thing was not what we had lost, but what we had gained by going through it all. With each new day, I felt more and more confident. I was no longer someone who was afraid to step forward. Now, when I looked in the mirror, I saw a man who was stronger and wiser, someone who had lost a lot, but had gained something much more valuable: self-confidence and the ability to move forward despite the pain. Laura, who was by my side during this time, became not only a support for me, but also the person with whom I could build a future. We started planning trips together, enjoying every moment, and I realized that despite everything that had happened, I was no longer alone. We all go through our own tragedies, but it is important not to get stuck in the past, but to move forward. That's how my story with Amanda ended, and although this chapter was painful and difficult, it was part of the journey that brought me to a better understanding of myself and what I want out of life. The recovery process was not instantaneous. It was slow, painful at times, but liberating at the same time. Life was slowly being filled with new meaning. I no longer cared so much about what I had lost in the past, as I began to realize that what I had gained was far more valuable. I could be happy again, without looking back at those dark moments that had once changed my reality. Laura turned out to be the one person for me who understood me without too many words. We started building a relationship, taking our time without pressure, because we were both ready to take new steps, but realized that time requires patience. I began to feel the joy of simple things again, taking walks, talking about the future, planning trips together. These were the moments I had missed so much after everything had fallen apart. Meanwhile, Mark and Alex continued their search. We were each in our own healing process. I watched them slowly open up to new life. Alex, despite his pain, continued to find ways to learn to trust again, and although his process was slow, he was increasingly beginning to realize that life doesn't end with one tragic moment. It was easier with Mark. His attitude towards life was always more positive. He used to say that at some point we all begin to realize that the most important thing is not to be attached to the past, but to learn to live in the present. We often met together, shared our thoughts, and helped each other find the strength to take new steps. Time passed, and the relationship with Laura became more and more serious. It wasn't like the previous relationship. There were no illusions or false expectations. We talked openly about what was important to us, what we wanted from the future. Laura didn't try to be perfect, and that attracted me even more. She didn't pressure me. She didn't try to build a relationship to someone else's standards. It was a real connection built on trust, openness, and respect. One day, after a long day at work, we went for a walk in the park, discussing our plans. We didn't talk about the past, but I knew it would always be a part of us. It wasn't an obstacle, more like a lesson we had all passed. You know, James, I think the most important thing in a relationship is not to try to create an ideal, but to build a reality where each of us can be ourselves, Laura said, looking at me with a smile. Those words sounded like a revelation. We often strive for the ideal, for what seems right and beautiful, but what really matters most is to be honest with each other, accepting weaknesses, imperfections, and learning to forgive ourselves and each other. Our life with Laura evolved naturally, without effort, without pressure. At some point I realized that not only was I free of the pain of the past, but I was ready for true happiness. My life was no longer defined by Amanda, divorce, or betrayal. I was free. However, it wasn't all that simple. Enough time had passed since the divorce, but the memories hadn't disappeared. There were times when questions would pop back into my head about whether I could have done things differently, whether I could have ever changed the outcome. But gradually I learned to accept these thoughts as an integral part of my journey, not as a weakness, but as an experience. Mark and Alex decided it was time to move on. Mark soon met a woman with whom he began a relationship, though without taking any rushed steps. Alex continued to work on himself, realizing that he needed more time to learn to trust. We all began to move toward a new life in which old mistakes and regrets had no power. I realized that divorce and the pain of betrayal were part of my journey, but did not define it. Those experiences were the lessons that helped me become the person I am now. I was not the weak person I once appeared to be. I learned to be strong and not to be afraid of change. When I looked at my life again, I saw that the future is not made up of past failures. It will not be complete just because I experienced pain. The future is built on the strength I find within myself. A few more months passed, and I finally felt that I had fully recovered. I was ready for new heights, ready to continue my journey. I didn't know what was ahead of me, but I knew the future could be bright. Laura was there to support me, and although we hadn't made any concrete plans for the future yet, I knew that I had found trust again. And then one such evening, as Laura and I sat again in a cozy cafe, I realized that all of these events, that they had brought me to a place where I could finally say, I'm ready to move forward. Life doesn't always give you answers, but it always gives you a chance. I knew one thing. There is no such thing as impossible for me. Everything that happens is just part of the journey. And perhaps that is what true happiness is. Not to stay in the past, but to look boldly into the future, not afraid of new challenges, but with confidence in myself and my abilities.